Welcome to week 14. This week we're going to deal with the media and the communications process and how that relates to the formulation and conduct of foreign policy. The authors talk about the idea that there is a conventional wisdom regarding the media and that there is a much more complex reality. Uh, Liberals want to say that there's a conservative bias, that the owners of the media tend to be conservative. Conservatives want to say that there is a liberal bias, that most journalists are liberal. The reality is a lot more complex, that in fact there are business imperatives that impose other kinds of biases that may actually be more important than ideological bias. And of course, we can talk about that in the forum. Um, the selectivity of the media is something that we need to talk about as it relates to foreign policy. When you look at the mainstream media, they don't often cover foreign policy, and that's part of the reason why Americans tend to be fairly low information participants in the foreign policy process. Most Americans don't know that much about what's going on in foreign policy, largely because the media that they consume don't really cover it all that much. Because the media, like it or not, is publicly traded and privately owned, and they are in the business of making money. And so if it makes them money to cover foreign policy, they cover it. If it doesn't, then they don't. And the tendency is that that coverage of foreign policy tends to be episodic at best. So what is the mainstream media? We typically are talking about the main drivers of media, and that would be the papers of record. Certainly the Christian Science Monitor, but most importantly, the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal are what we call papers of record. And they are really the origin point for American news as it relates to politics and foreign policy. So most of the stories that you hear on television or on the radio are stories that were first reported, by those papers of record. Let's talk a little bit, in the text they talk about foreign policy coverage since World War II. World War II, of course, was the good war. That was the war that Americans were pretty unified. It was hard to vote against defeating fascism, and most Americans wholeheartedly supported it. It was a consensus war. Certainly, the Cold War, much of the coverage was favorable, and indeed, that was again another instance where there was a consensus regarding how we should be conducting the Cold War. And very few people within the media or in government really rejected the notion that we should reject and confront communism. Vietnam becomes the war that really breaks the Cold War consensus. It's a war that the media increasingly came to the view that successive administrations, and in particular the Johnson and Nixon administrations, were being untruthful with them and untruthful with the American people. And that's really what began the process of transforming the relationship between the media and politicians. And this is something that began in the 1960s, where increasingly the media went from being lapdogs to attack dogs. Remember, according to the media, they're supposed to be watchdogs, and so those are issues that we can talk about. Media coverage. There are a couple of very important issues that we need to talk about. The fact that the media is highly concentrated, a smaller and smaller number of corporate concerns own a larger and larger percentage of the media. I think we've recently seen with Sinclair that they own a huge swath of the local news stations. And what does that mean? It means, there are entire regions of the country where most of the local news is being delivered by a corporation that has a very clear ideological perspective that they are pushing. And so, the challenge is not whether it's liberal or conservative. The challenge is whether the media is behaving in a way that puts people in a position to make a decision, right? And again, I think that it's important to make that sort of a distinction. It's not really ideology per se. It's the lack of alternatives that creates concerns. I mentioned a little while ago, the media is a business. It's publicly traded, it's privately owned. That means they care more about making money than they do about it, typically any particular viewpoint, which means journalists tend to be fairly liberal, but a lot of journalists make a heck of a lot of money, which means that they tend not to be that interested in paying high rates of taxation. They also tend not to understand the role that religion plays in a lot of rural parts of America. Um, the media have a tendency to follow certain norms, which means they are reliant on official sources. They are, as the book describes, they are rivals in conformity. Uh, you also have the reality that they have a bias towards official sources of news, which means they, especially as it relates to foreign policy, they have the golden triangle. They go to the White House, they go to the State Department, they go to the Defense Department for the news. And so all of these are very important. We can talk a lot about them. I hope we learn a lot over the course of the week. As always, if you have any questions, please raise them in the forum, or email me directly, or drop by my office if you want to, and hopefully I can clear things up. So let's learn a lot this